My truck is a 2003 Ford F-150 with a long scratch down the passenger side that I never got fixed. The paint around it has started to bubble a little at the edges. I know I should take care of it, I just never do. I wear the same 3 pairs of jeans in rotation. I have one good flannel for church and one regular flannel for everything else. My boots are Wolverines that I bought in 2009 and resoled twice since then. People see me in the hardware store or at the diner on Route 9, and they see a retired guy who maybe did some contracting work, maybe drove a truck for a living, maybe has a pension and a small garden and not much else to think about. That's fine. That's always been fine with me. My daughter, Elaine, got married 4 years ago. Her husband's name is Donovan. He works in finance. Or he did, the kind of finance where you sit in a glass tower and move numbers around and call it strategy. He was good at it, actually. I'll give him that. He made regional director at Meridian Capital Group by the time he was 34, which is not nothing. He wore suits that cost more than my monthly utilities and drove a car that had a heads-up display, which I only know because he told me about it the second time we met. The first time we met, he shook my hand and looked at my truck, and then looked back at me with an expression I've seen before. Not rude, nothing you could point to, just a small recalibration happening behind his eyes. He filed me somewhere in his mind under a particular category, and that was that. Elaine loves him. I believe she still does. That matters to me more than most things. What she doesn't know, what almost nobody knows, is that Meridian Capital Group is a subsidiary of Harwick Holdings, and Harwick Holdings is mine. Has been since 1987, when I bought the original company from a man named Purcell, who was tired and wanted out. I built the rest around it over the following decades, one acquisition at a time, mostly quietly, mostly through people who understood that I preferred it that way. I never told Elaine because I raised her to work. Her mother and I agreed on that before her mother passed. We wanted Elaine to know who she was without any of it. She got her own apartment at 22, her own car at 23, her own career as a hospital administrator. She did all of that herself. I was proud of her the whole time, and I didn't need her to know about the rest of it to be proud. Donovan I never told because it never came up in a natural way, and then too much time passed, and then honestly I was curious. Not in a mean way. Just curious, the way you get when you watch someone in a particular setting for long enough. I wanted to see who he was when he thought nobody important was watching. For the first 3 years, what I saw was mostly fine. He was polite to me. He helped Elaine when she needed it. He worked hard. He came to Thanksgiving and ate 2 plates and said the stuffing was good, which it was, because I make it with Italian sausage and sage, and I have been making it the same way for 30 years. He called me by my first name, which is Roy. Wait, no, my name is Gordon. Gordon Fitch. Nobody calls me Gordon except my accountant and the woman at the DMV. Everyone else calls me Gordy, including Donovan, and I never minded that. The thing I noticed, and I noticed it early, was that Donovan thought in tiers. Everything for him existed in a hierarchy, and he was always calculating where he sat in relation to everything else. He did it unconsciously, the way some people tap their foot or check their phone. He'd mention his bonus in a way that wasn't quite bragging but was bragging. He'd name drop a restaurant and then make sure you understood what it meant to get a table there. He was never cruel about any of it. He just couldn't help ranking things. And I was, in his ranking system, somewhere near the bottom. Friendly old father-in-law, drove a beat-up truck. Lived in the same house I'd lived in since 1979. Didn't have much to say about the market or the Fed or whatever the conversation at the table was about. I'd ask him questions sometimes, and he'd answer in the patient, slightly simplified way you talk to someone when you're not sure they'll follow the details. I followed the details, but I didn't correct him on that. The call came on a Thursday morning in November. I was in the backyard pulling up the last of the tomato cages when Elaine called and said she needed to talk to me about something. Could she come over Saturday? And could I maybe plan to have lunch ready because she was going to bring Donovan and his parents? I said, sure. She said, just so you know, Dad, his parents they're used to a certain kind of thing. And I said, what kind of thing? And there was a pause and she said, just, a certain level of presentation. And I said, okay, Elaine, I'll clean up the kitchen. She laughed a little, but it was the laugh that meant she was nervous. Donovan's parents arrived in a silver Mercedes S-Class. His father, whose name is Whitmore, just Whitmore, that was how he introduced himself, no first name offered, was a tall man in pressed chinos and a sport coat that looked like it belonged in a catalog aimed at people who summer as a verb. His mother, Constance, had the particular posture of a woman who has attended a great many events at which posture was being evaluated. She looked at my living room the way a building inspector looks at a ceiling. I had made chicken salad and cut some tomatoes from the last of the garden and put out rolls from the bakery in town. There was iced tea and lemonade. Whitmore looked at the spread and then looked at his wife, and something passed between them that I wasn't supposed to see. We sat down. Donovan talked about his department and a new initiative they were rolling out. Elaine talked about a project at the hospital. Constance asked polite questions, and Whitmore ate without saying much. I refilled the tea. I told a story about the hardware store guy who'd ordered the wrong size PVC pipe for 3 consecutive weeks. Whitmore smiled in the way you smile at a story that is not for you. After lunch, the dishes were cleared and Constance said, "Gordon, we've been hoping to sit down with you about something." "A family matter," she said. "Very exciting, actually." Whitmore produced a folder from the bag he'd brought in with him. He set it on the table and smoothed it with his palm. It was a thick folder, the kind that has been prepared in advance by someone who is used to preparing things in advance. He said that Donovan had been working on a proposal for his own investment firm, that he had the vision and the track record, that this was the right time in the market, that all he needed was a capital foundation to get started, something to anchor the first round of institutional funding. I said that sounded interesting. Whitmore opened the folder. He slid it across the table toward me. He said that they had spoken with their estate attorney and that they were in a position to contribute a significant portion of the initial capital, but that for the funding structure to work, for the institutional partners to feel confident, they would need additional assets on the balance sheet, hard assets, something Elaine might bring as her equity stake in the venture. I looked at the first page of the folder. It was a document that laid out, in very clean legal language, a proposal for Elaine to assign a portion of her anticipated inheritance to the new firm as collateral. A substantial portion. The kind of number that had a lot of zeros. I set the page down. I looked at Constance. I looked at Whitmore. I looked at Donovan, who was looking at the table. I said, "And where did you get the figure for the inheritance?" Whitmore said they'd had Elaine's financial picture looked at, professionally, that they knew she was the sole heir of my estate, and that, based on what they could determine, property value, certain public records, there was enough there to make the structure work. I said, "You had my daughter's financial picture looked at." Constance said they'd done what any responsible family would do before a significant business commitment. I said, without asking her. Nobody answered that. I closed the folder. I sat with it for a moment. Outside the window, one of the tomato cages I'd left, propped against the fence, fell over in the wind. I watched it fall. I said, "Donovan, do you want to tell me what firm you'd be launching?" He looked up. He said it would be a new entity, a clean start. Meridian Advanced Capital. He'd retain his relationships from his current role. He had a partner lined up. He needed to leave Meridian to do it, which meant, I said, which means you'd be leaving Harwick. The room went quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that has a shape to it. Donovan looked at me. He said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "You'd be leaving Harwick Holdings. That's the parent company of Meridian Capital Group. I should have introduced myself more formally 3 years ago. I'm Gordon Fitch. I'm the majority owner and chairman of Harwick Holdings. I have been since before your wife was born." He stared at me for a long time. Constance made a sound that was not quite a word. Whitmore looked at the folder on the table like it had said something offensive. Elaine said, "Dad, just that." "Dad," I said, "I know. We'll talk." Donovan said, "That's..." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "How is that?" I said, "It's a private holding company. We don't publish much. I prefer it that way." Whitmore said, "So you..." He gestured at the folder. I said, "Yes. Which means I'd like to talk with my son-in-law about his notice of intent and his non-compete before we go any further with this particular plan. But I appreciate you putting it all in writing. That's actually helpful." Constance said something about needing some air and went to stand by the back door. Whitmore closed the folder and pushed it slightly to one side, as if distancing himself from it. Donovan sat very still. He had the look of a man running calculations that weren't coming out right. I got up and refilled my iced tea. I asked if anyone else wanted any. Nobody answered. Elaine walked with me to the kitchen. She stood behind me while I put the pitcher back in the refrigerator, and she said quietly, Why didn't you tell me? I said I was going to. There was never a right time, and then there were a lot of right times I missed, and then it had just been so long. She said, how long? I said, the whole time. I've had it the whole time. She said, Meridian. He works at Meridian. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, did you give him the job? I said, no. He got the job on his own. I didn't know who he was when he started. I put systems in place so that wouldn't happen, so that family wouldn't come in through the side door. He got regional director because he earned it. I checked after we met. He earned it. She nodded slowly. She said, okay. I said, okay. She said, I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot to sit with. But okay. I put my hand on her shoulder and she let me keep it there for a minute, and then we went back to the dining room. The folder was still on the table. Whitmore was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, which I noticed because it was the most human I'd seen him look all afternoon. Constance had come back in from the door. Donovan had not moved. I sat down. I said, here's what I want to say to everyone at this table. Donovan looked at me. I said, you have done good work at Meridian. Your numbers have been strong. You built the Eastern portfolio from a regional also ran into something that actually turns heads. And I want you to know I've noticed that, and I'm not saying otherwise. He said, okay. I said, if you want to build your own firm, that's a conversation we can have. There are ways to structure a spin-off that protect both sides. There are proper channels for that. I have lawyers who do exactly that kind of thing, and they're very good. He said, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. He said, I would have. I know. There was a silence. Whitmore said we weren't trying to. I said, I know what you were trying to do. I'm 67 years old, and I've been in rooms like this for a long time. I understand the logic of it. But I want to be clear that my daughter's inheritance is not a collateral line. It's not an asset on a balance sheet. She'll have what she'll have when the time comes, and she'll decide what to do with it. That's the end of that part of the conversation. Constance said, of course. Whitmore said, of course. I said, good. After that, the lunch kind of disbanded. Donovan and Elaine helped me bring the rest of the dishes in. His parents shook my hand at the door, both of them, with both hands, which was different from how they'd greeted me. Whitmore said it was a pleasure and meant it in a different way than he would have an hour ago. The Mercedes pulled out. I watched it go from the front porch. Elaine stayed. She sat at the kitchen table while I washed the bowls, and she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, how much is it? I said, enough. She said, that's not an answer. I said, it's a significant amount. You'll get the full accounting when we sit with the attorney. I've been meaning to do that anyway, she said, and Donovan's job. I said, is his job. Nothing changes there on my end. I meant what I said. He earned it. What he does next is his choice. If he wants to have that conversation about a proper spin-off structure, my door is open. She looked at the table for a while, then she said, Dad, why did you live like this? I said, what do you mean? She said, the truck, the house, the flannel shirts. I said, I like my truck. I like this house. I've been wearing flannel since before you were born, and I'm not going to stop now. She smiled a little. She said, you could have told me. I said, you didn't need it to be who you are. And you didn't need it to be who Donovan was either. I wanted to know who he was without it. I think I know now, she said. And I said, he's a man who works hard and ranks things and sometimes forgets to look at what's actually in front of him. But he loves you. I can see that too. She nodded. I said, that counts for a lot in my experience. She stayed for another hour. We watched some of the game, and I made coffee, and we didn't talk about any of it for a while, which was actually the nicest part of the afternoon. When she left, she hugged me at the door for a long time. She said, I'm not sure whether to be mad at you. I said, that's fair. She said, I'll figure it out. I said, I know you will. I stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the road, and then I went back inside and finished the dishes and turned off the kitchen light and sat in the front room for a while in the quiet. The truck was in the driveway. The scratch was still on the passenger side. I could see it from the window in the porch light. I thought I might finally get it fixed. I thought about that for a while. Then I decided probably not. Some things you keep because they're yours, and you know exactly how they got that way, and that's enough.